Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our Climate Change Dialogue. My name is Ewan Hislop. I'm Head of Technical Research and Science at Historic Environment Scotland, and I'm also co-chair of the International Climate Heritage Network, and I'll be chairing our climate conversation today. I'd just like to highlight there's been some changes to the original programme, so this session is running from 3 to 3:55 GMT, and that the time overall is now 45 minutes. Well, we've brought together three fantastic panelist experts from across our field to stimulate the discussion today, and I'm very delighted to have them with us and I'm looking very much forward to this conversation. Keith Jones is the National Specialist for Climate Change at the National Trust. He started his work with the Trust in North Wales and became well known for his groundbreaking work on decarbonisation and renewable energy installation. He recently has worked on developing a climate change adaptation framework across the National Trust estate. And Keith is also a founder of the Fit for the Future network for sharing sustainability knowledge and collaboration. Lisa Westcott Wilkins is an archaeologist and co-founder and managing director of Dig Ventures, who is a UK-based platform that enables civic participation in archaeology and heritage projects and specializing in tech-enabled digital engagement, including alternative funding. Through heritage-based engagement, they feed into economic and social sustainability on a range of projects at regional, national, and international scales. Amanda Pollerino is Head of Conservation and Registration at the Queensland Art Gallery and the Gallery of Modern Art, where she leads a team engaged in a wide range of conservation, collection management, and exhibition work. Amanda is coordinator of Environmental Guidelines Project for the Australian Institute of the Conservation of Cultural Material, and she's author of Environmental Guidelines for Australian Cultural Collections, published in 2018. She's an expert in environmental parameters, sustainability, and increasing access to collections. And I should point out that Amanda joins us live from Australia, where it's very, very early in the morning. So I'm particularly grateful for her to being with us today. Our topic today is climate change. And we titled the session, Climate Change and COVID. As our sector increases its response to the climate crisis, we are right now in the midst of another global crisis with the COVID pandemic. There's been an immediate and severe impact on all of our lives, personally and professionally, and we've seen government intervention on an unprecedented scale. Some of the impacts on us as a profession may be short-term, others may well be longer. So can we learn from our responses to this pandemic? And are there intersections between these two global emergencies that we should consider and may provide us with an opportunity to recalibrate as we address climate change going forward? What I'd like to do is to invite each of our panelists to speak for a few minutes on this topic, and then we'll move to a more open discussion. To our audience, I'd like to say, please use the chat to submit comments and questions. We are very short on time, so we may be limited in the number of questions I can put to the panel, but it would still be great, nevertheless, to get some wider input on this topic and to see your thoughts on the discussion. So I'd like to invite our panel to say a few words to kick us off. Keith, would you like to kick off, please?
Thank you. I think the COVID shock on my organization, well, on the way I live and the way I do things, but on my organization, like everywhere else, is unprecedented. The fall in income or our ability to do the conservation work has been, well, catastrophic on it. When you're working on 30 million visitors that don't turn up and you're dependent on the income in order to look after special places, you have to reassess. But there is a silver lining for me personally here, in that the organization has reassessed and, so we say, reaffirmed what's important. These special places that we look after and share to people, they've been of more importance than ever. People have wanted to go out. People have wanted to experience locally stuff that is significant to them. And it's actually underlying importance of heritage and special places to help with people coping going through this time at the moment. But also, the climate change doesn't really care about COVID. The impacts that we're feeling from it's been, I think it was the wettest February on record. If everything else carries the same, it's going to be the hottest year on record. It was the sunniest summer on record. Everything I'm saying at the moment is on record on it. So therefore, we're having to look at how do we make the National Trust and the things that we look after for the nation fit for the future. And conservation and adaptation change can quite often be at loggerheads because we're talking about changing things that we hold dear onto it. The Trust has set a science-based net zero target, which I think is very ambitious for a visitor heritage driven organization, and we're about to embark on something called ISO 14090, which is the international standard for adaptation or managing change. How do we make the Trust fit for the future? COVID has sort of given us the space to look at the impacts that we're feeling and then to start the dialogue internally and with the world.
Thank you, Keith. Lisa, could you say a few words, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone who's watching. As an archaeologist in a born digital organization, our experience of the COVID lockdowns and the sort of very sharp swing of everybody else operating digitally has been quite interesting. One of the things that we're really thinking hard about and have been for quite some time is how much we can amplify physical experiences with digital content and vice versa. How do we create that as a spectrum for people who can't necessarily always come to the places where we're digging and be a part of it in person? So for us, when the first lockdown hit, we were already there. We were already online with really good content, actually. And what we experienced was an explosion in our audiences, some of which, I mean, most of which, 90% of which had never previously undertaken any kind of archaeological content. So that is, for all of us organizations who work with visitorship, the holy grail, really, 90% new audience. But thinking about that and looking at the sort of trends in a post-COVID world, we're already seeing, in archaeological terms, the swing of heritage tourism away from the normal urban centers where it's expected and where organizations are set up to receive that level of tourism, out to these rural places and local places, like Keith was saying, where people are either experiencing their own local place in a way they haven't before, or looking for stuff to do in a sort of very easily reachable area. And many of these rural places aren't set up to deal with that volume of visitorship. So archaeologically speaking, what does that mean for our landscapes and for our monuments, and how can we be planning around that, which is a conservation issue. And then sort of thinking post-COVID, moving into the future, something this panel touched on very briefly in our earlier conversations, the weather events and the patterns that are changing as a result of climate change and floods and fires and everything else that has an impact on our historic environment, it's not going to go away and probably is only going to continue to get more extreme. So as archaeologists, how do we approach this? We can't stop it. Is the right thing to do to be rushing around constantly trying to prevent it? Or do we just accept these interventions as a part of telling the stories of the places that we care about so much? Recently I went for a walk in my local landscape and I saw a prehistoric monument that still has a water line on it from a flood. Rather than scrubbing these things off or trying to prevent that part of the story, should we just figure out a way to accept it and build it in?
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. I'm getting excited. There's lots of interesting topics coming up here. Let's move to Amanda now. Amanda, what's your first opening thoughts?
Thank you. Well, it's down in the Southern Hemisphere and working in a large organisation that does contemporary art exhibitions. It's been a very interesting environment for us in the COVID world. We are imminently about to open a major exhibition which has required the shipment of works from several locations in the Northern Hemisphere. And COVID has really presented us with some challenges in terms of how we actually access and move work. So we have seen the cost of freight for artworks go up 150%. And shipping artworks was always expensive, but 150% increase in that cost is quite extraordinary, and that will really shape how we undertake major blockbuster exhibitions now. It's the economic cost is something that is going to be particularly important because we can't get the volume of audiences into galleries as we used to. But the silver lining in that, though, is that there has been a significant reduction in our carbon footprint and our greenhouse gas emission count based on the fact that we're not doing as much travelling. So couriers aren't travelling with artworks, and we've moved to video conferencing as a way of engaging in condition reporting, assessments, and installation. And that's quite a new world for the conservation realm, and that's been actually for us working really well. And so I think our adaptation to using digital technology has been very rapid, and it's been quite successful. And I think we'll probably in the very short term see a huge change in the way we manage these the exchange of artworks. So it's a really exciting time, I think. COVID, although being very challenging, has really brought forward some advances in the way that we interact as a community, which I think we'll be able to build on. And the counterbalance to that is less travel and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think really positive things to build on there. Climate change is a real concern in Australia, where the projections are for hotter, drier, reduction in humidity, and reduction in rainfall. But in terms of rain events, there'll be fewer rain events, but much more severe. So the chance of flooding is increased. Our fire weather has increased. So it's a very concerning change in our environment, and something that is that we really need to take account of now, and change some of our practices to move ahead there.
Thank you, Amanda. That's terrific. And I like the term silver linings, and I think there's something there we can focus on. Can I just come back to something that I think both Keith and Lisa touched on, but maybe Lisa, we talked about the shift in our audience and in the people that we engage with, and it's around this sort of localization, this sort of change in the way people are moving and traveling, and we're seeing a different set of people interested in heritage, and often this is about localization. How do we reconfigure to tap into that, into a new audience? There's a new demographic there as well, I think, in many cases. How do we best engage? I was going to say finances. We'll come to finances later on, but how do we engage?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that, from the perspective, for example, of yourself or Keith, who have venues, or maybe many of the other people listening manage venues that are grounded in that way, that they have their own place, because our networks are spread out all over the UK, and oftentimes are people that don't even live here. So I would say maybe just to reframe the question is just, if you are in a local place and you're starting to see a different demographic, using your place, perhaps the best thing to do is to not try to overplan your offer. Let them experience it and do the best that you can to understand what they're getting out of being there. Because I think all of us brought a lot of assumptions with us into COVID about why people consume what we have to offer. But what we've been most surprised by in our conversations with our new community is that they're getting something completely different out of those visits than what we might have understood or thought that they would think was important. So I think really what places that represent a local area, or that are in a local area, as a resource like that can do now, is to just be open to the kind of feedback that's going to challenge maybe what you understood about your own value previous to COVID.
From my side, seeing, because we've had to go to a booking system to ensure we don't have too many people on site, and the demographics that's coming back, it's locality, because relevance is the single most important part for me for heritage. If it's not relevant to you, you don't value it. If you don't value it, you don't look after it. It's been interesting seeing the membership, because we were approaching 6 million members on it, and quite often you can accuse people of being members because it's a transactional undertaking. I get cheaper parking, or I get a discount on this, and quite a lot of people haven't have renewed their membership because they believe in cause, they believe in heritage, they believe in their locality. And that's been quite heartening, really, because we could have looked at it in a purely transactional financial sort of way, but it's about the place, and it's about the heritage element and the values that comes with it. Because we have so many members, our demographic is quite wide, from families through to older people who are used to going to a place onto it. But it sort of chimes with a lot of the work that we've been doing with our outreach work. It's given it a good chance to breathe, to where we've showing that this is of relevance to you, or there is access availability here. It's really helped. So I think the trust was changing at the same time as COVID hit us as well. So it was quite a good, almost a perfect storm for us on it. Next year it's going to be interesting, because it's always, to me, it's always legacy and impact, and therefore what's going to be the legacy from COVID? Is it the same people, or are they suddenly going to go to the Mediterranean or somewhere else? So that's going to be an interesting measurement to see if there's a legacy from this.
I think so, and I think that's really interesting in terms of climate change, that's the sort of longer burn changes that we need to do as a sector to build in sustainability, to decarbonize, to look at lowering visitor carbon from visitor travel, etc., and perhaps appealing to more local audiences. So it's really interesting to see how I think we as a sector move forward with this, and how we engage with perhaps a different set of people at our sites. Something that I think all of you have said and implied there is about the importance of our places, the importance of heritage places to people. That's an interesting concept in a disruptive time, in a highly disruptive time that we're facing now, how heritage has meaning to people. And I think that's interesting going forward in terms of climate change, which will mean disruption, global disruption to many communities and societies and populations. Thinking about the value of heritage and that sort of sense of continuity that it brings to us, and a sense of where we have come from as a people or a community or a race, gives us perhaps a resilience as we move forward. Just thoughts on that. Keith, you first mentioned this about our places are more important than ever.
Well, it's an interesting one as well, because I've been having a chat with a few neuroscientists in terms of the value of place and heritage. And when looking through the climate change mirror, heritage has this perception of permanence. It always has been, therefore it always will be. But we know that the climate reality is completely different when you're looking at shifts in temperature, storms, all sorts of things. So we're debating, well, we're researching at the moment using place and heritage as a climate change mirror. That if this thing that you value and treasure and love is under this impact, and this is the change that we're going to have to do, what does it mean for the rest of society? So to me, there is a value in heritage when looking through the climate change lens as well.
And Lisa, presumably in your profession, I mean, you're recording environmental change, you're recording change through time. I mean, you're telling the story of change in what you do in the everyday that you do.
Yeah, and I mean, archaeology is a disruptive process. So the job really is to, collect as much evidence as we can so that all the different aspects of that story can be told. There's always surprises. And when it comes to, for example, there's probably many people listening who work with the archaeology of buildings are trying to understand the change in buildings over time very visible. But when you see, the just massive changes in the landscape that we encounter as archaeologists, you recognize that these changes and adaptations are constant, and we're calibrating them every day. And so, just looking at the questions in the sidebar of this session, I can see a lot of people really wondering now about digital technology and how much that can really translate the value, let's say, of a heritage or art experience for people who can maybe no longer physically interact with the artifact or with the building or the painting or the other sort of piece of culture that they want, they want to experience. And I think for us, all of us listening to this conversation, that really is the biggest question, because regardless of when we all are able to travel again, perhaps we will now all be making different choices about that kind of travel because of all the climate factors, for example, that Keith has been mentioning previously, and that we all know are there and are maybe being ameliorated by the COVID situation. So, as an archaeologist, I too feel it's a really exciting opportunity to sort of challenge not only the methodology of how we're recording the past, but who we're involving in doing that, and what this post-COVID digital focus allows us to do in terms of opening up those conversations and perspectives.
Amanda, can we talk a little bit more about, you touched on how the pandemic has affected practice around exhibitions and loans. There's been quite a lot of interest in that in the chat about how's that practically working in terms of virtual condition checking, and how do you see this going? Is this a permanent shift? Is this a positive move forward?
I think so. I think there certainly from an Australian perspective and from the gallery perspective, there has been quite a bit of focus on how we change our practices and adapt to a more climate active approach. And so we have, the gallery community has agreed to broaden their temperature and RH parameters for borrowing and wool exchanging collections. So we're seeing changes in our loan agreements that allow institutions to operate their air conditioning at broader parameters to reduce. It's an energy efficiency approach, but also reduces our carbon footprint. And then if we're also adopting an approach of doing video conferencing, we're not having couriers traveling, but we're still having that oversight that within the gallery and museum sector, there's a very strong requirement and a desire to have institutions being able to see their works when they travel, to be able to condition report them at the venue where they're going to be installed. So it's all very new, but from my experience, it's all working very well. We have just been undertaking video conferencing with an organization in the US. And of course, the time difference is quite challenging, but for a couple of hours, very early in the morning here, we're looking at motorcycles that have been sent from the US. And I think it's about 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening in the US. And so as long as there is good planning for this kind of activity, it's working quite well. It is reliant on very good internet access. And I think that might be the challenge when we start to look at this kind of activity with people in the regions. So, in Australia, still in some of our rural areas, our internet access is quite patchy. So there are challenges to continue along this road, but it is certainly the way of the future.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on your respective sectors. And Keith, how as a sector do we need to prepare? We know climate change is happening. We're beginning to see impacts of different sorts in different parts of the world. How do we get a grip in terms of preparedness and measuring vulnerability and thinking about resilience?
Well, I actually think it's more of a psychological problem than it is a technical problem on it, especially so in the conservation realm. Conservation the definition of conservation is the management of change on it, but conservationists quite often struggle with change because we have a condition we need to meet, or something needs to be the same as it was before because that's what it should be. And therefore this is why I'm quite interested in the neuroscience psychology element of acceptance of change, or acceptance of a different form of normality in there. So we're working quite hard on the data and the analytics in terms of understanding the threat. So we're doing quite a lot of work of bringing an awful lot of academic work together for people to make informed decisions on, because quite a lot of the research is academic driven. It's not end user developed for you to make a decision on what the risk, what the vulnerability, what the exposure looks like. We then need to look at the acceptance of change and policy on loss onto it. Again, although there are peaks of excellence all over the place on it, because there is an inevitability, our insurance won't cover it, or we physically cannot do the intervention on it. And then where's the threshold? Where's the line? That's a bit of work we're looking at the moment. When is the climate factor so much that you have to move the contents of a house to somewhere else, or adapt the grade 1 listed building to a different environment on it? There's regulatory challenges and stuff on there as well. To me, we're in the foothills of it. At the moment, we're trying to understand the size of the challenge. Then we need to prioritize the impacts before we get to the adaptation response. The adaptation response, the what do we do bit, is relatively easy if you trust the data and if you trust what you've already done. Then we need the competence and the people in place to make informed decisions, and they need to feel supported in policy and regulation and leadership to make the decisions. Sorry, that was a bit of a tirade, but at the moment we're understanding the size of the challenge.
Amanda, you're right on the sharp end of some of this in terms of environmental conditions for collections, and you've edited a major revision and taken a very fresh look at this topic. Are there tensions around this, or how is the sector embracing these challenges moving forward?
I do think there are tensions around expansion of parameters, around new ways of sharing collections, access to collections. Because I think we're right on the cusp of change, and sometimes I feel like as conservators we are, as Keith mentioned, we're fixers. So we're not great at adaptation yet, and I think it's a bit fearful. It's a different way of being a conservator, to sit back and go, well, perhaps I can't fix this, so I'm going to have to think about it in a different way, and maybe that's a generational thing too. I feel that students who are coming through the conservation education and coming into the community now are much more able to adapt and change their practices and to think differently. So we could be seeing a shift simply through, a new community of conservators coming through. But in Australia, through the gallery network, we are definitely pushing a new approach, and some have taken it up and run with it, and been confident in the research and accepting that it's time for change, whereas others have continually questioned, is this the right thing to do? Is there enough research about expanded parameters? So it's interesting, and we're right at that point where there's still some resistance to change. It was interesting, a registrar said that it's time to get off autopilot. And I thought she nailed it really with that. I think we have been on autopilot for a while, and now we need to shift and question the research, adapt to it, and undertake our own research in our own small environments, and I think gain some confidence there.
Well, I couldn't agree more on the research side. I think drive the research. I think we really need to drive the research and set that agenda out. I think it's a responsibility of us to set that out and push harder in terms of how research serves us going forward. I'd like to just think about that spectrum from change, resistance, resilience, to the sort of far end of that, where we talk about where we're having to deal with loss and significant change and loss, and just bring Lisa in on this. I mean, certainly in some projects I've been working on recently, we've sort of realized that we're changing the language in some ways from resistance to acceptance, and we have once you have a good understanding of that science data, those constraints that Keith's talking about, and you're as informed as you can be, you then realize we have to deal with this in a different way, and accepting loss is something we have to go on with. Now, yours is a profession that is quite close to that in many ways. So just interested in your thoughts on that.
I'm probably very much on one end of the spectrum, different from my colleagues, because as an entrepreneur, you have the complete change for me is what I look forward to every day. And when I'm presented with a situation, I immediately look for ways to do things differently, because I assume that things are the way they are simply because it's been done that way forever. So for example, in our own work now, we're looking at different ways of actually, sort of tearing up the way archaeological sites are recorded and doing it in our own way to suit the fact that we now have digital tools that they didn't have 50 years ago when the system was developed. Which I'm sure any of my colleagues who are listening will be, making horrified faces about, but this is what I mean by change. And, any young people or students who are listening, I would encourage you to go really, really back to the basics and say, why are we doing it in this way? There is a point when these decisions for conservation or for preservation in situ or for excavation or for any of our other processes that we do as heritage professionals, there's a point when the decision gets made to move forward with a certain methodology. And that is the point. I think now we need to start asking ourselves, are we taking the first right steps always in all of these processes? Or is it time to actually say, we're on autopilot in all of these ways, and this is the opportunity for the environment so that we can do our jobs better through the use of efficient digital technology. And also, in a post-COVID world where the virus is going to be lingering, are we making those in the best possible way? And for people of our generation, it's a harder question because we are trained and used to doing things in a certain way. But I work with a lot of young people who push me every day to ask those questions, and I actually feel better in my practice as a professional for that.
But on the adaptation side, adaptation is everything from loss, acceptance of loss, because that is a management decision. We're not going to do anything, and therefore that is an adaptation response to it. To digitizing everything, that is an adaptation response to it. It's not we're going to change a thing. It's an acceptance that it's a different place, and therefore the thing, the asset, the monument will have a different purpose or a different function, but we won't lose why it's there and what's happening there. So because there's a question around resilience here. Resilience, you can adapt to be resilient. The adaptation is still a part of that as well. So where people think that resilience is about holding the line, it can be, let's move the line, and therefore we're resilient to this different state.
Yeah.
But where are we as a sector on that, Keith? I mean, how easy is that for us in the lack of standards that support that, in perhaps the lack of national frameworks from large bodies like yours and mine? Do we need leadership on this?
Because it's missing, because the regulation on listed buildings, scheduled ancient monuments, or on natural capital is about keeping a thing in a certain state. We're going out, we're working with the regulators. There's a place called Mullion Harbour down in the south where we are looking at loss. We're putting thresholds in to say, once it passes this bit, we will not repair. We'll pull back to the next line. We need this research and these case studies in order to engage with the regulators, in order to have fundamental change in the laws to support decision making. There's a head gardener I work with in London. She's saying, I'm working on in this grade 1 listed garden. It's got box blight. It's endemic. It's on the way out, but it's a main feature of the garden. When do I stop? Where is the red line here that I have to do it differently? That at the moment is missing. The support structures to enable people to manage change isn't there. So we're developing our own internally at the moment, but we're far from it. What is acceptable change? Don't know.
So this is about shifting from reacting to being proactive and being in an informed position to make those decisions. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the difference between being in opposition to something and then offering, if you're in opposition to it, you know, you can only be reactive, but if it becomes part of your proposition as an organization or as a sector, if we have the support, you know, that we need, then it becomes part of what we can actually offer, is helping to help others manage that change in their environment as well.
Amanda?
Sorry, Amanda.
Oh, Keith, I was just going to pick up on your point about supported change. And I think that's a really key thing, that we need to be cooperative and in these approaches to adaptation in order to gain resilience. And it's finding those ways of engaging in supported change. So that's one of the reasons why we tried to do a cooperative change to our terms and conditions for lending, because if we didn't do it cooperatively, I think no one was confident enough to really be the first person to make an adaptation there and change their parameters. But collectively, we've been able to push it through as a group, and so we're, you know, the thing to do now would be to look at the museum sector in Australia and engage in that cooperative and supported change as well.
There's a question here from Bianca in terms of what do you think of the paper ethics about the ethics of doing nothing. The thing is, it's not doing nothing. If you're doing nothing, you've made a decision. You've taken an action to do nothing on it. There is no such thing as ignoring it and letting it go away. You have to make a decision on it, and therefore the action has been taken. There are certain places around the coast where we've said we're going to have to let them go because economically and morally we can't do anything there. So how do we do the best out of a bad job? Where do we do the rescue archaeology in order so that we can learn just before it disappears into it? So there, to me, in my organization, there isn't a do nothing stage, that you have to take a decision to say, to let something go its natural course.
This conversation on loss and change is stirring up a lot of interest in the chat, and I think a lot of support for what's being said here, and I think a lot of interest in how the profession needs to look very carefully at the way it's behaving and the way it moves forward. And I think a realization this is a really crucial issue for us as conservationists or preservationists or whatever baggage we carry with us into this discussion. I want to move on a little bit. I'm interested in the sort of issue about inclusivity and inequalities. We know that climate change affects those who are least empowered to do anything about it. It affects them most. We are also in a situation with the pandemic where there are funding crises all around us. And how do we as a sector right now address that challenge? And is there some synergy between, again, where we are now with COVID and how we move forward with climate change? And Amanda, just in terms of the sort of constraints around lending, which traditionally require considerable resource to meet the rigid standards. What's your sense now about, I mean, does this mark a potential shift about us being able to be more inclusive in terms of working with smaller galleries and sort of involve communities and others?
I would hope so. So part of, we knew that as we changed our parameters, there would be an effect on the regional and rural galleries that that are interested in borrowing from the state collection. And so we're right now really looking at that. Recently, I did speak to the Small Museums organisation in Queensland, and you know, they had 70 delegates who managed to attend that conference, and that was only from the southeast corner of the state, because due to COVID, we couldn't get delegates from further in far north Queensland. So there was a huge interest. You know, these people are very interested in accessing and sharing collections and being part of a wider network of being able to get state collections. So there's a lot of interest there, but the challenge is that in a lot of those environments, they're the communities that are being more radically affected by climate change because they're away from the coast. So it's harder for them to maintain reasonable conditions, and I'm talking about even passive control in their community museums. So they're dealing with climate change at a faster rate than we are along the coast. So it is really challenging because we want to broaden the opportunity, but we also have this counterbalance of communities who are struggling with in drought for extended periods of time. The temperature, their annual temperatures have increased. You know, there's a lot of research to show how Australia has already shifted. Our winters are shorter, our summers are longer, our wet spells are fewer but more intense. So it's the challenge is extreme, and it's finding ways through that. And I think that as much as we want to digitize our collections and make them available online, people still really want to see the objects, and they want to have them in a local context. So there's a lot more work to do there. I think it's a big challenge.
I'm really glad you said that at the end, because I was interested in that point particularly because we've talked about the use of digital and the advantage of digital engagement, but that sense that these objects and these places are still very important to us physically, I think is a very important point that we mustn't lose in this discussion. Unfortunately, we're getting very short on time. I just wanted to kind of finish with something about really, I mean, we're all speaking with a, let's say, a degree of seniority. What would each of you say to young people entering our profession or hoping to enter our profession, and in terms of your advice for them? Lisa, would you like to start? You have already brought this up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that, you know, actually my advice to them would be, look, the way that people consume culture is changing. 5 years ago, Netflix and having everything on demand was not a part of how we actually consumed our culture, but it's definitely having an impact on how we frame our work and the kinds of devices and ways that we know that we need to be present for people. So for young conservationists or archaeologists or anyone coming into the field now, I would say, you know, understand how important it is for your work that you have an audience of some kind, whether they're coming to your place or they're consuming you online, and, you know, really be thinking hard about creative solutions to make it possible for them to experience what you're doing in line with their own expectations. They may never expect to actually experience your local place or your venue in that way. We don't know what people are going to feel and think that are much younger than us when they get to that point in their lives. And so I would just say to be open to how different it might be for them. Things are changing fast.
Keith.
Well, if I was doing my degree again on it, which is my degree is partly to do with what I've ended up doing in terms of the environment work, it's relevance and application. Because at the moment, a lot of the climate change work is theoretical and modeling this, that, and the other. But one of the big tests I've got in work at the moment is I've got this virtual general manager in my mind, and they're usually very grumpy and they're very busy onto it. What you're saying is, yes, it's really important, but what does it mean? What do I do? So if you just are constantly looking at problems, you will people will walk away from you. So what does that thing do? What's the benefit it's going to deliver? So it's the application of knowledge, which is the most, to me, is the single most important thing. Yes, pure research is important, but what does it mean to place and to people, rather than that's a really good spreadsheet, now go away.
Okay, Amanda.
I would say stay open to opportunity. I never expected to be doing what I'm doing. I thought I would be doing archaeology. That was my, that's where I thought I'd be as a conservator. So my career has taken all kinds of corners and changes as a consequence of just being open to opportunity. And the other thing that I would say is I'm really interested to know what emerging conservators have to say. And I have been working with emerging conservators on a climate change, climate adaptation paper. And I benefited so much from Ainsley Meredith's ability to understand technology that was far beyond me. So I can't wait for emerging conservators to make their way into the profession.
Thank you. I am going to have to stop this conversation because I'm afraid we're out of time, tragically. The chat has been fantastic. I would recommend people look at that. There's immense value in there as well, I think. I think given the short time we've had, we've only been able to scratch the surface of this topic. I hope we've been able to tease out some key issues and that everyone's found it a useful and stimulating discussion. Whatever happens with COVID, the climate crisis is going to be with us for a long time. Please continue this conversation, continue the chat on social media. I know that IIC wants to hear from you on this topic. And also a reminder to check out the Climate Heritage Network, in particular, the Culture for Climate events that are happening over the next few weeks. Do check that out too. We have to go now, so I'd like to thank our awesome panel for giving up their valuable time and sharing their insights. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. And also a word to those working way behind the scenes, in particular, Riza, Jessica, and Neil. Thank you very much for your support. And finally, thanks to everyone for listening, and goodbye.